Okay, so assume you can see me and also see my screen.
Yes.
Great. Welcome everybody to BIOH122. This is we're up to week 8 and session 14. This week we are going to continue with the digestive system, in particular with a focus on the stomach. In this week's tute, what we're going to cover is some of the anatomy of the stomach. We're going to talk about some of the primary functions of the stomach. We're going to have a look at a closer, point of view of the cells that are involved and what they do, and some of the structures and the layers of the muscle. There's actually 3 layers of the muscle in the stomach when compared with the esophagus or the small intestine or the large intestine. We're going to talk a little bit more about the cells. So these tiny little guys along here, talk about what substances they secrete and the action of those substances. And then finally, we're just going to fill in a few terms where we link the description with the respective organ. Okay, so not overly complicated, but yeah, I think there's a little bit to do there. All right, so kicking off, obviously we can access a great image of the stomach from our textbooks. Again, I've loaded up the one from the library, and it describes some of the major functions, or some of the major structures of the stomach. The stomach actually has 3 layers of muscle, which are all angled, or the fibers are arranged in different orientations, and this aids with the slow peristaltic movements of the stomach, which occur at about 2 to 4 waves per minute. So it actually does move quite slowly. You can see these rugae, these kind of little folds on the inside of the stomach. They help to increase the surface area and aid with digestion. They also allow the capacity for the stomach to expand, to get a little bit larger, and it allows the stomach to hold between 2 and 4 litres of food, or chyme, as you call it, once it's become a little bit soupy and has had time to mix with all the secretions and excretions of the stomach. So 2 to 4 litres, it's quite a lot. Think about a 2-litre carton of milk. It's quite large. And now think about 2 of those together. So that's kind of the volume that we're talking about. That's how much the stomach can actually stretch, and these rugae have a role in that. There's a lower esophageal sphincter at the very inferior part of the esophagus. This here will close and prevent reflux of gastric secretions up into the esophagus, which can actually damage the esophagus. If that's happening, we call that heartburn. There are medications that people can take to, if they are suffering from heartburn, to either neutralize the acidity of the stomach, or just to alter the contractions so that we don't get that happening. But the lower esophageal sphincter will usually close and prevent the gastric acid from going up into the esophagus and causing damage. Another key structure is the pyloric sphincter, this one here. This sphincter here, just to give you an idea, sphincter is a muscle that allows, it's not under, well, the majority of sphincters are not under voluntary control. And so you can't close them by thinking about it. The pyloric sphincter will close, and it will only allow little bits of chyme through from the stomach into the duodenum, which is the start of the small intestine. It'll close and only allow little bits through at a time. So the stomach really acts as a storage facility for food, but it helps to mix and churn the food and to make it into a soupy chyme that's able to then slowly be released into the first part of the small intestine so that we can get maximal surface area in contact with the necessary enzymes so that we can spread the contents along the small intestine for maximum absorption. So, food might sit in the stomach for, between 2 and 4 hours. Depends on what you eat. Carbohydrates will tend to be released and move through the duodenum quicker than proteins, and these will both be quicker than fats. So usually very high fatty foods will cause a slower digestion, and that's why it's suggested with drugs like alcohol, you have some fatty food, because it'll slow the absorption of the alcohol, and it'll mean that it has less of an acute effect in the bloodstream, and therefore on cognition, I guess. So there's a little bit about the function. So it takes 2 to 4 hours to clear, and that can range depending on what's been eaten. There is a process called retropulsion that occurs. So what will happen is we've got these very slow peristalsis waves that move through the stomach. We only get about 2 to 4 of these waves per minute, so they're not frequent. But what they do is they'll move food towards, or the chyme, towards the pyloric sphincter, and then anything that doesn't move through, that 3 mils that doesn't actually get through, will kind of move back towards the pyloric antrum, back towards this way, that doesn't get through. And that's called retropulsion. So it's where the chyme will attempt to move through, but if it doesn't, it'll come back towards this pyloric antrum. The stomach can absorb a number of different things. The stomach can absorb water, it can absorb ions, small fatty acids, and also drugs as well. So there is some absorption occurring here, but remember that the majority of the absorption is going to occur in the small intestine. Okay, so there's some of the key structures. The fundus will act as a bit of a storage area. So I'm just going, the fundus will act as a bit of a storage area, and what happens is in your mouth you actually produce something called lingual lipase and also amylase, lingual amylase. And amylase digests starch, lingual lipase will start to digest fats, but the mouth is quite a neutral pH. When you swallow the food, the bolus of food, with these enzymes that have been produced in the mouth, they will come down into the stomach, and they can continue to act within the fundus area, but generally speaking will be inactivated by the acidic environment of the stomach. And the reason it's acidic is because of the release of hydrochloric acid. The acidity of the stomach is multifold. It will help to prevent bacterial infection, and it will also help to activate pepsinogen. Pepsinogen through hydrochloric acid gets activated, becomes pepsin, and pepsin is an enzyme that will help to break down proteins. So we'll start to break down proteins in the stomach because pepsinogen is converted to pepsin by hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid will also act to aid in the breakdown of proteins through this conversion, but also stop any type of infection from getting in. And then once protein's digested, it can be further digested in the small intestine. Okay, so anyway, that's a little bit about the anatomy. There are those 3 muscle layers that help to aid in that chain process. All right, so functions of the stomach. Let's have a look here. We've got a few. So it mixes saliva, food, and gastric juice to form chyme. CHYME, I don't know, it's CHIME. Reserves serves as a reservoir of food before release into the small intestine. So, as I mentioned, we can store up to 2 to 4 litres of food here. Secretes gastric juice, which contains hydrochloric acid, which kills bacteria and denatures proteins through the process of activating pepsinogen into pepsin. Also releases something called intrinsic factor, which will aid in the absorption of vitamin B12. And gastric lipase, which will help to break down and digest triglycerides or fats. Also secretes something called gastrin into the blood as well. Gastrin into the blood. So there's some of the functions. I'll just jump over to let's just go here for a second. Just contrast that. Sometimes I like to jump between the textbook. I like to jump between the textbook and the notes, because sometimes they might differ in small ways. So you can find the functions of the stomach listed just above that image we looked at just before. Okay, so coming down now, the next part we're going to look at is more about the microanatomy. Microanatomy in particular, what we're interested in is the cells and what they're doing. You can see here there are a number of cells. I'll come down in the textbook to show you this. So we've got these gastric pits. The gastric pits serve to increase the surface area of the stomach. With more lining, we get more surface area. So for example, even though this is only a few micrometers across, if you were to stretch from here to here, stretch it out like a string in a straight line, you'd realize that it's actually very long to go from here all the way to here. So through this, this pitting, through these gastric pits, we can increase surface area, which will aid the absorption. But also the capacity to digest as well. So there are a number of cells present, and we're going to look at those cells. We also have the different number of muscles. We've got an oblique layer, a circular layer, and a longitudinal layer of muscle. We have talked about the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and the serosa before as being the different layers of the gastrointestinal system, and we did mention that they can vary depending on where in the gastrointestinal tract we're describing. This is what the gastric pit looks like zoomed in, and these are the different cells. So we've got surface mucus cells. These secrete mucus. We've got mucus neck cells, which also secrete mucus down here. We've got parietal cells that secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. We've got chief cells that release something called pepsinogen, which is that kind of proenzyme that becomes activated when it comes into contact with hydrogen chloride and becomes pepsin. And the chief cells also release gastric lipase, which will start to help to digest the fats. And then we've got G cells down here, and the G cells secrete the hormone gastrin. Okay, so here's a histological view of that. So a cross-sectional view of what the cells look like and how they're ordered in terms of their height. When we look at the gastric pits up close. Coming a little bit further down, we want to know a little bit more about these cells. So if we scroll down, here's a summary of the different cells and what they do. So the surface mucus cells and the mucus neck cells, they secrete mucus, obviously. The mucus has a number of different functions though. It both serves as a protective barrier that will prevent digestion of the stomach. So it'll effectively help to protect the stomach from the hydrochloric acid and from the activities of the pepsin. If you get a stomach ulcer, what can happen is, for example, the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin, in addition to the bacteria that's kind of caused the stomach ulcer, will the pepsin and the hydrochloric acid can actually cause a hole to form in the stomach. And so it's important that we have some level of mucus there to prevent the stomach from this auto-digestion, from digesting itself. Okay, we also have it has a role in absorption. So small quantity of water ions and short chain fatty acids and some drugs can cross this mucus and enter the bloodstream. Parietal cells. So they were the mucus cells, the surface ones and the neck ones. We've also got the parietal cells. They secrete the intrinsic factor and also hydrochloric acid. Intrinsic factor is needed for the absorption of vitamin B12. It's used in red blood cell formation and erythropoiesis, which is the same thing. So erythropoiesis is the creation of the red blood cells. And also releases hydrochloric acid. As we mentioned, that kills the microbes, helps to denature proteins by converting pepsinogen into pepsin. Okay, hydrochloric acid can also be released by the activity of acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nervous system, or it can also be released in response to histamine as well. There is, we'll talk about somatostatin in just a moment. There is a way that this is regulated. So the release of hydrochloric acid is regulated through something called somatostatin, which we'll talk about in a moment. Chief cells secrete the pepsinogen, and as we mentioned, they'll become pepsin and break down proteins into the smaller peptides. The chief cells will also secrete gastric lipase, which will split the triglycerides into the fatty acids and also monoglycerides. We have the G cells. They secrete gastrin, and gastrin will help to cause the release of hydrochloric acid. And also through this process, it's the hydrochloric acid that will activate the pepsinogen to become the active pepsin. So what this means is you need an acidic environment for the digestion of proteins. That is so that you can convert pepsinogen into pepsin. The gastrin will also have other functions in control of the gastrointestinal system. So it'll contract the lower esophageal sphincter. That way, when you're releasing hydrochloric acid, it's not going to go up into the esophagus. It increases the motility of the stomach so that we start to churn that chyme, and also relax the pyloric sphincter, which is the sphincter that connects to the small intestine. We've got muscularis. So these cause the mixing waves, the peristaltic movements. They churn and physically break down the food and mix it with the gastric juice and help to form the chyme. And through this process, they move the chyme through the pyloric sphincter. And then the pyloric sphincter, opens and permits passage of chyme to the duodenum. It regulates passage of chyme from the stomach to the duodenum and prevents backflow of chyme from the duodenum back into the stomach. So we don't want to get movement backwards from the small intestine back into the stomach. So let me just make sure that was all those parietal mucus G cells. Yeah, so this, we just mentioned a few extra structures in that description. But I guess it provides a little bit more context than what was just limited to the tutorial. Okay, so I assume I'm not going to describe the process of absorption of the macronutrients because that's all described in the lecture notes. I'm just going to keep it strictly limited to what's in the tutorial. I won't go into the kind of the more complex physiology behind it, at least not today. All right, activity 3, name the organ that best fits the description below. So now what we're doing, let me just make sure I've just covered everything that I wanted to cover in relation to that. Yep, good, okay. All right, so this last part here, we're kind of moving on from the cells of the stomach, and we're now looking at, you know, some of the accessory organs, some of the organs that aid the gastrointestinal system in doing its job. We've got the gallbladder, which we know stores bile, which is produced by the liver. Obviously, the liver is a powerhouse of enzymes. And we've also got the pancreas, which we know also releases enzymes that will aid in digestion. So we have to just fill in, link which one of these relates to these different, I guess, descriptions. So what has both an exocrine and endocrine function? That is, what releases onto the outside of the body, but also releases hormones onto the inside of the body. We have talked about this one before. That's the pancreas. The pancreas both releases enzymes into the gastrointestinal tract, which is considered because it's when something's within, whenever something's within the gastrointestinal tract, it's not yet in the body. It's not yet in the body because it's effectively like a hollow tube that goes all the way through. It's not in your body until it's been absorbed into the bloodstream. So if it's getting released into the gastrointestinal system, it's an exocrine gland. So it releases digestive enzymes into the small intestine. So that gives it its exocrine function. But as you know, the pancreas also releases insulin, for example, and that there lowers blood glucose levels, and it releases insulin into the bloodstream. So that's what gives it its, you know, endocrine function as well. Also releases glucagon, which is the antagonistic hormone to insulin, so which has the opposite effect. It increases blood glucose levels. All right, primary function to store and concentrate bile. Well, I kind of gave that away. That's the gallbladder. It stores the bile from the liver and concentrates it. Ejects bile into the cystic duct. Again, that's the gallbladder. Likely to be biopsied if cirrhosis, has cirrhosis or hepatitis. If we talk about hepatitis, we're really referring to the liver. So the liver goes into there. Let me just double check that one. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Likely to be, bilirubin, absorbed from worn out red blood cells, is secreted into bile here. So that occurs in the liver. So bilirubin, which is absorbed. So when you break down old red blood cells, you produce this stuff called bilirubin, and it's kind of released and into bile. So it happens in this process happens in the liver and gets, you know, transferred to the gallbladder. Contains vasocytic cells known as satellite reticuloendothelial Kuffler cells. So this one here, is L. That's also the liver. The site of carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolism. You know, the liver is really a powerhouse of metabolism, so you should be making that connection there, that those two are related. And removed in a Chol's cystectomy. So some people get gallstones, particularly the elderly. And what happens is the gallstones can cause a lot of pain. They can block the movement of the bile. And so some people can either get the ducts removed or can get the actual whole gallbladder removed through this cholecystectomy. So that's G. And secretes somatostatin from delta cells. So somatostatin is a hormone, growth hormone, inhibiting hormone, which actually is part of a feedback inhibition loop to inhibit the release of gastric acid. So it actually just kind of slows digestion and inhibits the gastrointestinal functions. And somatostatin is released by the pancreas. Okay, so that about summarizes the tutorial for today. Hopefully that's provided you with a little bit of extra insight and information into the stomach and the way it works. And yeah, just kind of gives you some perspective on the different functions of both accessory organs and some of the cells that are involved in the stomach as well. Okay, guys, any questions? No. All right, guys, thanks for coming, and I will see you next week.